Hi, this is Pastor Barry with the supplement video for our first discussion in Mark chapter 11 on verses 1 through 26, entitled In the King's House. I want to start by noting that this is a different passage than the one that we had originally scheduled. So if you look at that first discipleship group discussion guide, part 1, the schedule on there says that we're studying verses 11 through 13. And after a consultation with Kim and Eric Porter, who wrote this study, we decided to shift it to verses 1 through 26. And you're going to pick up verses 27 and following in the next study. So I have redone the handouts in the resource section of the website. If you downloaded those earlier, you're going to want to go back to the website to make sure that you have the ones where the right verses are being double spaced. So it should be double spaced verses 1 through 26. Second thing I want to note before we kind of jump into the study is that in the second half of Mark, having background becomes increasingly important. Before, you could just open your Bible and kind of look and read the story and talk about the story. Now, it becomes helpful to have a bit more background. Eric and Kim have included some of that background in the discussion guide, so you want to make sure that you have the discussion guide with you in the group. One of the things they included is a list of Old Testament scriptures that I think you're going to find very helpful, especially early on in this passage, verses 1 through 9 or 10, verse 1 through 10. So those Old Testament passages become very important. You're going to want to be able to read those out loud and talk about how they're significant for this passage. The other thing that they gave you was a diagram of the temple, a floor plan, if you will. And this is helpful in understanding what was happening when people were selling and buying in the temple. They weren't all the way through the temple. They were in a certain part of the temple, and that is significant in reading that particular section of the scriptures. So make sure that you have the diagram with you. But in general, pay attention to background. I have an extra Bible dictionary that I'm willing to lend to anybody that asks. It might be helpful to have a copy nearby when you guys are doing your study. I will also try to put some background information on the website that you can download for those who are interested in having a little bit of enrichment. Last thing I want to say is pay attention to context. We talked about this in the last video. Context is always important when we're reading anything, but in particular maybe when we're reading the Bible. It's important to know where we are in the story. It's important to know something about the cultural background. And like I said, I want to help you with some of that, but you're going to find that that is very important as you go through this study. So let's talk about Mark 11, 1 through 26. In the initial part of that passage, verses 1 through 10, you have the scene of Jesus coming into Jerusalem. And he comes in riding on a colt. We know from other places in the New Testament that it was a donkey colt. And this ends up being in the fulfillment of prophecy. So you have those verses there in the guide. Crowds are laying out their garments in front of him. This is a royal kind of a welcome. We see this again. The porters have given us the verse for that. It's a kingly welcome. And think about it a little bit like rolling out the red carpet for someone. And then the last one is paying attention to the words that people are shouting. They're crying out for deliverance, for salvation. Those words are the same in the Greek. And that shouldn't be a surprise when we think about the bigger context. If you think about the time of year that it is, this is the Passover. The Passover is the Jewish celebration of the deliverance of Israel from 400 years of slavery and oppression in Egypt. It is always the place that they look back to remind them that God is faithful and that God delivers and that God is just. He will defend them. And so around this time of year, messianic expectation is running high. They are looking for a king who can set them free and who can bring about equity. Okay, what follows in verses 11 to 26 is the interaction of Jesus with the temple and with the fig tree. And what you find is that in the way that Mark structures this passage, the fig tree and the temple are related to one another. They're meant to be read together. Now, I'll show you what I mean. So in the telling of the story, Jesus goes into Jerusalem and he goes into the temple. And he's looking for something. Mark doesn't tell us what he's looking for, but he looks around and then he leaves. And then the next thing that happens in the story is that Jesus is hungry. And so he goes to a fig tree that is in full leaf, but finds that there are no figs on it. And so he says, may no one ever eat fruit from you again. And then the next thing in the story is he goes back to the temple and he drives out all who are selling and buying in the temple, and he overturns their tables, and he won't let anybody carry anything through. Again, he quotes from the Old Testament here, and you're going to want to know what that passage is and why it's significant. And then when he comes back outside, the disciples see the fig tree and it's withered away. So you have this temple, fig tree, temple, fig tree. Jesus is looking for something at the temple. He's looking for something on the fig tree. He judges the temple. And when he comes back out, he has judged the fig tree. Or the results of his judgment have become clear on the fig tree. So the fig tree kind of operates as like a symbol or a parable of what Jesus is doing inside the temple. I won't go through all of the questions here. I think the porters do a good job of this, but just sort of talking about some of the general contours of this thing. Jesus is hungry for something. What is he looking for at the temple, and what does he actually find there? I think he's looking for a house of prayer for all nations. This is what God intended the temple to be. It was supposed to be a place where people from all over the world, not just Jewish people, but all people, could come and learn about God and worship him. But when he goes to the temple, what does he see? Well, he sees all this buying and selling going on. And the way this passage usually gets taught, or often gets taught when I've heard it, is that this is a cry of Jesus against commercialization. Jesus doesn't like that they've turned the church, the temple into a marketplace. And so we shouldn't turn the church into a marketplace. And I certainly agree that we need to be careful of commercialization, and our consumer mindset comes with us into the church, and we need to be vigilant about that. But I don't think that that's really what's going on here. These guys are providing an important service that allows people to worship. People need to be able to get a perfect animal to be able to give up and to be able to offer in worship, and they need a certain kind of money to buy that animal. So the service is useful, but if you look on that diagram that that shows the floor plan of the temple, where all this buying and selling is going on is in the court of the Gentiles. It is a reminder that what has been devalued is welcoming all the nations, because the place that they could come would be that court of the Gentiles, and in their space is all this buying and selling. It facilitates the worship of Jewish people. And so I think what Jesus is decrying here is the privileging of a few at the expense of the many. Jesus and God more generally meant for the temple to be a gathering place for all the nations to come and to worship him. And they're not using the temple that way. They use the temple as a way to allow themselves to worship and to keep other people out. And I don't think Jesus likes that. He calls them a den of robbers. One of the things I was reading says that word robbers is not like a thief. It's more like revolutionaries or insurrectionists, people that would want violent revolution, to bring the kingdom by violence. And whether the temple represents, on the one hand, the privileging of a few, like serving the insiders and enriching the powerful at the expense of the outsider, or whether the temple becomes the symbol of true Jewishness that violently overthrows the Romans. Jesus is not having any of it. He does not see the fruit that he longs to see. And so he pronounces judgment. He cleanses the temple. And what he does in the temple is reflected in what happens to the fig tree. It comes back out, and the fig tree has withered. After that section, so starting in about verse 22, you have this section about having faith in God and about saying to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea. If you don't doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. This is a passage that's going to be a little bit challenging in terms of teaching on prayer. Part of the problem, I think, is that we tend to rip it out of its context. We see it as a teaching on prayer rather than in the bigger context of these sort of social and political realities that Jesus is describing in his cleansing of the temple. He is declaring judgment on a system that doesn't work, that does not produce the fruit that God desires of all the nations coming to him. And then he goes on to say, have faith in God. If you say to this mountain, what mountain is it? Well, it's the mountain where the temple is. To be taken up and thrown into the sea, that it will come to pass. And this is, in fact, what happens. In 70 AD, so some 40 years or so after Jesus, the temple is finally destroyed and is not rebuilt. Now, possible applications here. The porters have a couple. One was, what are the ways that we are like the temple or the fig tree? That there might be the outward appearance of life, leaves or religious activity, but no fruit. I think that could be a really good question for your group to kind of wrestle with. And again, it needs to be under this umbrella of mercy where we can be honest with each other about where we're really at with God. It's not always going well between us and God. And so we need to be willing to say that and to ask for help, to actually have the reality of fruit in our lives. The second question is a question about how we could help Lighthouse to be a house of God that is more welcoming to all people. What are we willing to do? We tend to say anybody can come. We'll welcome anyone. They don't have to be what we are. They don't have to be Christians. They don't have to be Asian American or what have you. But what we sometimes mean by that is they can come if they're willing to be like us. And so I think there's a question here of how far we're willing to extend ourselves for the sake of including someone else and making them feel welcome so that they can come to know and worship the true God. Well, that's everything that I have for you today. If you have any questions, feel free to email or call. And God bless you as you continue your study in Mark.